Senator from Vermont.
Ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection. Under the previous order, there will now be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote in relation to amendment number 717 offered by the senator from Wyoming, Mr. Barrasso. Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this amendment protects the privacy and the safety of law-abiding gun owners. When government officials release gun ownership information, it puts many lives at risk. This includes the lives of lawful gun owners, the lives of law enforcement, and the lives of victims of domestic violence. State or local governments that release private gun owner information will now be penalized 5% of their federal program funding. This includes the release of private information on individuals who have licenses to purchase, or who possess, or who carry firearms. The funding that's withheld will then be redistributed to the states that are in compliance. This amendment will ensure that gun owners across the nation do not have their private gun owner information publicly released. Thank you, Mr. President, and I urge all of my colleagues to support the amendment.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
this is a case of Washington being big brother and telling each one of the states, whether it's Wyoming, Vermont, or Connecticut, here's what you have to do. We have no idea how it's going to affect them. We do know it's going to cut off a lot of money to law enforcement because it's telling states, even those states, its legislators have gone out for the year, that you got to have a one-size-fits-all. There's never been a hearing on it. It's a feel-good amendment. It will hurt our states, but most importantly, it will hurt law enforcement. If you want to have a discussion, that's fine. Let's have a hearing. Let's find out what it is. But to do this feel-good amendment to tell every one of our 50 states, after 2 minutes of debate, we're going to tell our 50 states, we know better than you do, and here's what you should do. It makes no sense, and I'd oppose it.
There's sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoeven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy,
No.
Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Crapo, Fisher, Grassley, Heller, Johans, Kane, and Lee. Senators voting in the negative: Boxer, Cardin, Carper, Franken, Leahy, Murphy, and Whitehouse. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, No. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott. Aye.
It'll be a surprise.
Ms. Baldwin. No. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. No. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts. Aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor. Aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden. Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada. No. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell. Aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. No. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. No. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates. Aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran. Aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Vitter, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, no. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, no. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Isaacson, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, Aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker. Aye. Mrs. Hagan. Aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski. Aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill. Aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey. Aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune. Aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman. Aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake. Aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez. No. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. No. Coons. Mr. Coons. Aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell. No. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? No. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mr. McCain? Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Chamber wishing to vote.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? On this vote, the yeas and nays are the yeas are 67, the nays are 30. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is agreed to. Under the previous